Welcome back to the Happy Saver podcast. I'm Ruth, a personal finance blogger living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in this podcast, I just chat with a diverse bunch of people and I learn their story and then I just condense it down into an essay so that you can hear helpful, relatable stories from Kiwis who are sharing their experiences, their tips and their point of view on personal finance here in New Zealand. Righto, on with it. This week's podcast is all about Julian, a 51-year-old from Christchurch. We picked up the phone for a good old kōrero in late June of 2025, and let's just say if talking were an Olympic sport, well, Julian and I would tie for first place. Late in 2023, useful financial resources started appearing on his radar. Not that he tuned into them fully, but they started him on a journey, and from there, he began his financial U-turn that led him to the Happy Saver and all the inspiring stories that I've shared. He discovered the Barefoot Investor, Rebel Finance School, Mr. Money Mustache, and the world of financial security and independence in general. In this way, he feels that as a late starter, he has found a community that values discussing money, and although he still has a way to go and he's easily distracted, he's feeling increasingly confident with the financial scaffolding that he has begun to put in place. He's got 14 years to go before his 65th birthday, and if he can keep himself on track, something that does not come easily to him, he's setting himself up for success. But before I really get started, I've just got a quick message from today's sponsor. When I first started to get interested in understanding where my money came from and went to, I meticulously noted each transaction in a spreadsheet. While a good place to start, I was short on time, and that practice lasted 1 month at best. Enter Pocketsmith. It helped me quickly automate my finances, which saved a ton of time. I like to explain Pocketsmith to people by saying it gave me the data I desperately needed to understand my money. I no longer have to compile that data, it does everything for me. Pocketsmith automates financial management by connecting to your financial institutions, such as your bank, for real-time transaction updates. Plus, it offers budgeting tools, cash flow forecasts, and net worth tracking, thus eliminating the need for manual spreadsheets. Thank goodness. If you want to supercharge your finances with Pocketsmith, have we got a deal for you. Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. That's pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. Julian's parents were both children of English immigrants who came to New Zealand post-World War II. Julian's family actually spent time in central Otago working on the Roxburgh Dam, which is actually close to where I live, before moving up to Christchurch to work as a carpenter and then a wharfie. Julian's mum's family moved to the West Coast, then over to Canterbury as well. And from the stories he has gathered, money was not something that they had much of, with his mum having to leave school at 15 to get a job and contribute to the family. She became a nurse and his dad finished high school and then went to university, the first of his family to do so, and then on to becoming an accountant. He was ambitious and over decades ended up becoming a partner in a national accounting firm. Julian said that he was born into a striving young family of the 1970s. Money was around, he said, and they lived, looking back, a privileged life, and his family worked their way into a financially comfortable position. Julian and his 2 younger siblings went to private schools, they skied in the winter, and they rode horses for the fun of it. They never explicitly talked about money, which he thought interesting given his dad managed other people's money for a living, but he was always aware of checkbook balancing going on, plus the occasional money meeting in the living room between his parents, and that his mum budgeted the money his dad gave her to run the household. Julian used to receive some pocket money, and although vaguely aware that you have to work for what you want and that money doesn't grow on trees, he didn't have any concept of what that really meant, so when he had money, he would just spend it. His dad was always very generous and supportive of the people he loved and cared for, and he still is, but he could be a bit controlling, which contributed to the breakdown of the marriage when Julian was in his early 20s, and he remembers his mum saying that his dad was very good at giving other people good advice, but not so good at following it himself. Now that Julian works with the construction industry, he said it's often the same with builders whose houses are never quite finished. He said he was massively inspired by his mum. She cared for 3 kids, plus Julian's dad when he was sick for an extended period, and worked nights as a district nurse to keep money coming in. Wherever they lived, she fixed the place up and made it a family home. In her 40s, she returned to school and finished off year 13, which would allow her to then go on to university, where she completed a Bachelor of Arts in Art History, plus a graduate diploma in management, and it was during her tertiary study that the marriage ended. He said of his parents' separation it was, quote, not cool, and his mum should have been better provisioned for in the separation agreement. Despite them both contributing equally but in different ways to the marriage and the family, his dad set about, successfully unfortunately, reaching a settlement that financially benefited himself. And that's something I'm just getting a bit sick of hearing about, if I'm honest. Despite his mum saying, let's settle things fairly, he was hard work, and she basically started again with next to nothing, picking up a management role in the health sector in Canterbury, working her way into a senior position. She never fully recovered from the financial hit she unfairly took in the divorce, but despite that, he said she built a good lifestyle in the end and that she is resilient, creative, and endlessly positive, and now in her 70s, she is still working 3 days a week. Today, not that Julian knows the actual numbers, his father is retired and in a really good financial position. Julian had part-time jobs in the school holidays, tapping into his parents' big social network. He was always babysitting, mowing lawns, washing windows, and blowing all the money he earned. He said he doesn't recall or never had any conversations around saving a portion of his income. Instead, it was more, that is your money, you earned it, do what you want with it, but just don't ask me for more because we already pay for enough. While intellectually smart, Julian was also a bit of a smart ass, but a softie who could run fast, get into danger, and then evade it, playing the rebel at school, pushing hard against authority. He had a lot of behaviour issues stemming from insecurity and attention-seeking, and he said that if he couldn't do something perfectly, he would soon lose interest in doing it at all. So he barely scraped through year 11, and then he screwed up year 12 completely, and his parents then got sick of paying for a private education that he was squandering, threatening to send him to boarding school where they might kick some sense into him. And in those days, they actually did physically try to whack sense into kids. But a family friend who worked as a concrete placer in Dunedin said, hold up a moment, send him to me for a summer and I'll sort him out. This was a bit of a wake-up call for Julian, but not one that would last. He then negotiated with his parents to enrol in another private school in Christchurch, which was Christ College, so he could repeat year 12, and he would pay for the first term if they would agree to pay for the rest, which they did. It was an absolute disaster, he said, with his misbehaviour leading to getting the strap a lot, then the cane, before being expelled at the age of 17, failing year 12 for a second time. He said he wanted to do things well, wanted to be perfect, but couldn't get out of his own way. But he was quite determined to get educated, so he enrolled in Hagley, a school well known in Christchurch for giving young people and adults who've had barriers to their education the chance to come in with a clean slate and learn. But he soon started hanging out with kids smoking weed in the park, and before long his school career ended once and for all. Unsurprisingly, his behaviour at home meant he was not easy to be around, as he fell into a bad cycle of sleeping half the day and being tired and grumpy when he was up and about. So his parents sat him down just before his 18th birthday, and they basically said they were not prepared to support him when he treated them so poorly and was so hard to be around. And they told him he was going to go and live at the YMCA hostel. To pay for it, they'd written a letter to Work and Income saying that they would no longer be financially supporting him, and basically he began to receive the unemployment benefit for kids under the age of 18. He said it was tough love, but they firmly told him while his behaviour was this bad, they didn't want anything to do with him, and he was on his own. Which Julian thought was great. There was no one giving him the lecture of getting himself sorted, and the unemployment benefit paid for his food and accommodation. For the remainder of that year, he lived a lifestyle of smoking weed and just sodding about. The government of the day offered to subsidise wages for 6 months if an employer agreed to take on a person who had been on the dole longer than 6 months. So this led him to his first full-time job aged 18 or 19, and that was working in a wholesale plant nursery, a business run by the parents of a mate of his. He lived week to week, and all of his money went on partying with his mates, living life and having fun, and that is pretty much how it continued for the next couple of years. His introduction to debt happened around 1994 when he was 20, and he decided to join all his friends at university and get a degree, paying for it with a student loan, which in those days started to accrue interest as high as about 8%, if I recall correctly, immediately. He said he somehow managed to convince Canterbury University that although he didn't have good results and records, he was a capable, smart young guy, ready to buckle down and get into it. His idea was to take a diverse variety of papers, and at the end of the first year, something would stick and he would then pursue that. The summer holidays before the academic year started saw him not working and saving, but spending 8 weeks in a Bedford van exploring the North Island party scene and scenery. Along the way, they picked up 2 Swedish hitchhikers, and he promptly fell in love with one of them, reluctantly parting ways so he could begin the academic year at Canterbury University while also starting a part-time job. When his now girlfriend's travels brought them to Christchurch, they reconnected, and despite him actually really enjoying and engaging with the lectures he did manage to attend, with a girlfriend on a short-term travel visa, time was of the essence, and he struggled to find the time and motivation to study. To get some more money coming in, he came up with the bright idea to get married, which would entitle him to more student allowance that would take his now wife into account. And when I was at university, friends of mine had a similar marriage of convenience. Plus, he maxed out whatever he could borrow on a student loan. His wife's visa expired and she returned to Sweden, inviting him to join her if he wanted to. Although a bit besotted by each other, theirs really was a marriage of convenience based around them both getting money, but still, Sweden did sound kind of interesting. So, now aged 21, he again bailed out of his education, boarded a plane and left New Zealand, leaving his student loan to quietly grow without him. At the time, Julian said he thought he was on an adventure, living life, taking opportunities, making great decisions, all while avoiding, he said, any concept of responsibility. Sweden lasted just 4 short months, during which time their love dwindled to friendship, and Julian moved on to London instead. And the upshot was he had no real skills other than the gift of the gab and a nice smile, which he used to talk himself into bar work. He was to stay in the hospitality industry for the next 15 years, living every single week, paycheck to paycheck, bouncing around Europe and back to New Zealand. He ended up living in Belgium for 3 years, working in pubs, but also branching out into teaching English, something that he actually really enjoyed. And everywhere he went, he was paid in cash, often under the table, and without the concept that such a thing as savings and pension schemes even existed. He sure as heck never paid into either. Julian and his girlfriend of the time would literally get some cash in their pocket, take the train to the airport, and board the flight that was leaving next, and that is how they ended up in Spain for 6 months, he said, which ended in him hocking the camera his parents gave him for his 21st birthday to pay for the accommodation debts that they were racking up. By the age of 24, his thinking was only short-term, and his life was spent constantly coming up with ways to dig himself out financially so he could afford to go on to the next step. It was a boom-bust cycle. In 1999, he was about 25, and a family wedding meant he had to return to New Zealand. He then stayed a year working in hospitality before bouncing back to Europe. He didn't really find a place to land, so in 2001 he again returned to Christchurch. And by this stage, the partying lifestyle meant he had developed quite a drinking habit and was starting to suffer from cycles of depression, attempting to use alcohol to self-medicate. He continued to live pay to pay with zero planning ahead. This changed a bit when he met his partner, who he stayed with for the next 8 years. He said that she was a sensible woman who had read a book about property investments, explaining to him that if you buy a low-cost rental property, you could pay it off over the next 20 to 30 years. The idea being that over your working life, you buy quite a few of these, and they are all paid off by the time you retire, giving you rental income to fund your retirement, She had already purchased one little flat and was on her way. However, both of them were easily distracted, it seems. Both working in hospitality, they started to develop a dream of having their own cafe, and while both were superstars at front of house, neither had the knowledge to run the kitchen or the business. So now in his late 20s, Julian decided to train as a chef at Polytech. He completed his study this time, going on to become a chef for a year and a half. In about 2003, aged about 30, the two of them decided to further delay their dreams and follow the money and get a job, working as contractors running an existing 5-star food and accommodation business in a tourist hotspot in New Zealand. They were provided with accommodation and a vehicle, earning $600 a week each, and his father told him that he needed to be responsible for paying his own taxes due to working as a contractor. Now, while some provision was made to stay on top of taxes, it did end up following him around for a few years after finishing. What he did do, though, was steadily pay off his student loans through deductions from his wages, and he remembers celebrating getting this paid off in full. Over the next 3 years, they bounced around again, working similar roles in Italy and the Greek islands, with his weekly pay rising to about $1,300 a week, and with no real outgoings, he considered himself to be very comfortably off. As a couple, they were all in. They lived in each other's pockets, shared everything. And clearly, forgetting her plan for a property portfolio, she sold her rental property, ending up with $20,000 after all costs. And between them, they saved up another $20,000, making a $40,000 deposit. Now, this is the first time that I heard Julian speaking about saving, and he was 32 years old. The two of them sat with a lawyer and they drew up a contract which said that they were putting in $20,000 jointly, but an additional $20,000 was hers. So if they were to sell or split, she would get her $20,000 back and they would split any gains. In 2005, they purchased a 2-bedroom apartment in a block of 8 for $120,000 with a $80,000 mortgage. It was on a floating mortgage rate, which hovered at about 6.5%, he said. They found a tenant and also paid a property agent 6% of the rental income to manage the property for next to no service in return. But they didn't have to top up the mortgage payments, so felt pretty confident that the mortgage would slowly get paid down over the next 20 to 30 years. Meanwhile, they continued on with life, both working and travelling. For the first time in his life, he got a credit card, which he and his spouse had joint access to. It had a $2,000 limit, but he regularly got calls from his bank offering to extend the limit. And he said that to him, it sounded like they were saying, "You can handle it." By now, he'd restored his relationship with his parents, and he talked to his dad, who said, "Son, whatever you do, don't do it. Talk to me first. This is a terrible, slippery slope." And thankfully, he listened. And from that point, he continued to run financial ideas past his dad. Julian said he was feeling pretty high on what they were achieving in life. And in order to build their portfolio, in 2006, they paid $149,000 for a second property, which he said was a bit of a crappy place to which they did minimal upgrades, which didn't sit well with him as he wanted to do better for his tenants. They put no money into the deal. The rent just covered the interest-only mortgage payments, meaning they were totally banking on capital gains. In 2007, they sold this property for $187,000. So their plan worked, and on paper, it looked like they made $38,000, but it was less than this. And anyway, it all went to paying the tax and ACC bills that they had racked up when contracting. So I had to ask, why didn't they stick to the great plan to acquire 6 properties and retire at 65 on the rent? They wanted to move back to the UK, so that was part of it, but he said they very much got caught up in the hype of a strong property market where you could buy a flat, spend nothing on it, not pay anything off the mortgage, and sell it and pocket the tax-free capital gain. It all felt so very easy, making him believe that they could do this all the time, anytime. Previously, when he lived in the UK, he said he was young, dumb, with few skills, but this time, now in his 30s, they returned to the UK with good solid hospitality management experience and qualifications too. He and his partner wanted to tap into the private service world with accommodation provided, catering to private families who paid really well. And although the accommodation was pretty sweet, They hated the experience and their 6-month stint with arrogant employers who were full of expectation and not very nice. So back to London they went, where he ran a pub and in comparison to his 20s, rented a nice house and earned a good income. But it was back to being paid in cash, and he remembers having envelopes full of money stashed in his sock drawer. Whatever they wanted, they bought. Wherever they wanted to travel, they went. And basically they spent all their money in the couple of years that they were there. There might have been a little bit of money sent back home to patch up something that broke on their rental, but really that was just spending too. Now by this point in our chat, I was starting to get a bit antsy around where Julian was going with his life story. I was wondering if he really had listened to all of my episodes after all, but sit tight, we are getting closer. But sadly, things sometimes get worse before they get better. For over 6 years, their relationship was rock solid. They were totally on the same page. But his job running not one but now 2 pubs meant that he was working too late, sleeping too long during the day, and barely seeing his partner. And by this stage, his drinking was becoming a real issue in his relationship, but he was oblivious to what she was trying to tell him, that he had a drinking problem which was destroying what they had together. And ultimately, she said, "I need space," and she took a job in another country for a period. In 2010, they both returned to Canterbury. She helped him get set up here all over again, and then she called time. And although it hurt, he respected her decision and how matter-of-fact she was in the end. The last thing holding them together was that one rental property. She wanted to sell and get her money out, but he wanted to keep it. The trouble was, he had no savings to pay her. No problem, you just ask the bank for money, right? Now this was when he realised that he had bought a property that had a really weird ownership structure, which I'm probably about to botch the explanation of. The piece of land and all the units on it had been divided up into shares, and he owned a proportion of shares that related to his plot size. When they purchased it, the banker they used was fully informed about this type of ownership and was happy to lend, but they had since moved on to another bank, and Julian was having real trouble finding someone at the BNZ who understood the structure, and as a result, they wouldn't lend him the money to buy his now ex-partner out. So they got an independent valuation on their flat, but unlike the increase in value in the previous property, this one just hadn't moved. Basically, because of the ownership structure, it didn't go up in value the same way as the properties around it. And in addition to this, Canterbury had just experienced the large September 2010 earthquake, so there was some damage to the property as well. And as Cantabrians began to enter an uncertain time, all of this impacted house prices. Julian went to his father for advice and was surprised and grateful when his dad said, "I'll lend you $30,000 at the same interest rate as the bank." So now with some money of his own, which let's be honest, he didn't have any money of his own because it was borrowed, the bank now agreed to lend him the rest, which was $30,000, so he could pay his ex-partner her share and then take full ownership. He was not 100% sure on the math when we spoke, but he's pretty sure when it was all sorted, he owed $60,000 on a tenanted rental property worth about $120,000. He found a flat to rent himself. He found a job in hospitality, working for a boss he didn't much like, so he had income coming in, but was feeling very sorry for himself. Also, to cope with the loss of his partner, he was drinking just way too much, he said. Then, in February of 2011, there was another massive and tragic earthquake, and everything changed for every single Cantabrian, of which Julian was one. He was already in a flow of change, and this took it to just a whole new level. His tenant packed up and returned to India. Given Julian worked in a restaurant and bar which was damaged and unable to open, he no longer had a job. He had his own rent to pay, and now, with no income from his tenant, he also had a mortgage to pay. It was while laying on the couch in the immediate aftermath of the February 2011 earthquake that he pondered how low he had sunk, and he asked himself the question, what the heck am I going to do with my life? And this was the first time he thought that something had to change, and that something had to be him. Now, having lived through many years of the Canterbury earthquakes myself, I know that in the immediate aftermath, people flocked to Christchurch to help homeowners. Well, Julian's mum phoned to say that some family friends worked in construction and they needed labourers ASAP, so he immediately jumped at the opportunity to help remove unstable chimneys, patch roofs, and repair cladding to stabilise and weatherproof housing. A few weeks in, while sitting on a roof recounting his sorry life story to one of the builders he was working with, he pondered if he should retrain as a builder. But the guy said, "No, not a builder. I've learned enough from working alongside you to know that you should become a quantity surveyor." Now, I'd learned enough about Julian myself by now to know that he had the base skills of being detail-orientated and analytical to be good at this job, if he had some training. Due to the massive Christchurch rebuild ahead, the construction industry knew they had a shortage of workers, so the Polytech put on a mid-year intake and squeezed a 2-year quantity surveying diploma into just a year and a half. And when Julian was not studying, he was working on the tools beside qualified and very busy builders, learning how to build and also how to measure for materials. So the two went hand in hand and were a perfect fit for his course of study. And finally, in his late 30s, he had a goal to focus on. Now, me being me, I had to ask how he paid for his study. Well, he received a government-paid student allowance of about $250 a week. This is money that you don't have to pay back. Plus, he was working and earning money up to the level that would not impact his student allowance payment. Currently, you can earn up to $276 gross per week before your allowance is impacted. So, all up, he had about $450 a week to live on. He paid for his course fees by taking out student loans, which were interest-free by this point in time. Now, while the hours he worked were capped, so his allowance was not lowered, his employer kept a tally of additional hours worked, and at the completion of his study, they paid these out to him. Now, maybe not 100% legit with this. His employer needed Julian to work, not stop midway through a job, and this was a way that suited them both, and Julian paid taxes on any income that he did earn. He got a flatmate to reduce his rent payment, he sold his car and bought a scooter to get around, and he said that looking back, he thinks he made some of his first quite sensible money moves during this time. His own rental property was now sitting empty and was quite damaged, and he thinks he might have moved to interest-only payments on his mortgage during this time. As his knowledge of the construction industry quickly grew, he realised he had the ability to help the business he was working for price repair work for EQC and also run the books for the company, something tradies who become business owners are notoriously poor at doing. He moved to working 20 hours per week explicitly doing this work while also studying full-time at Polytech, learning how to do it. He was excelling in his studies, and when he was done, he got his foot in the door as an estimator working with a company doing earthquake repair work. Julian had found his place and a career that fitted his personality and skills, and fortunate timing that he could fast-track his way into it. He found he loved creating spreadsheets and dealing with data, and it turns out he was very, very good at his job. His starting salary in around 2013 was $60,000 a year, and he thought he was in the clover, he said. The most he had ever earned before was $50,000 a year, and here he was on a starting salary of $60,000. The only way was up. In early 2013, his mum saw how grown up he had become finally and suggested they buy a rental property together. Well, without the ability to save any money over the previous 2 years, despite him having an uninhabitable rental property on interest-only payments and the fact he had no money to put in, well, they got a mortgage together using her house, which she still had a mortgage on herself, as collateral. They bought a 2-bed flat in Christchurch for $180,000. Now, as I wrote this up, I was shaking my head. All I could think about was 2 steps forward and 1 step back for Julian. Financial clarity, it seems, comes in stages. So they tapped into the huge need that Christchurch had for fully furnished short-term rentals of 6 to 8 weeks for people whose houses were undergoing earthquake repairs. They spent $15,000 to spruce the place up, right down to providing cutlery and sheets on the bed, and had it continually rented at about $400 a week, but he couldn't quite remember, from the very beginning. He managed all of this, and it covered all of their costs and paid back the additional $15,000 loan pretty easily. But that market did dry up quite quickly, and it became just a standard rental property earning about $300 a week gross. Just 1.5 years after buying, they sold it for $245,000, taking a capital gain of $65,000. Due to lack of supply and a very high demand, house prices were increasing, and he worried that he couldn't afford to rebuy with his half of the capital gains, which was about $32,500. He visited the bank and was told his $60,000 income was just too low to get a mortgage, so again, he sat down with his father to discuss options. His father gave him a cash gift, no strings attached this time, and now with a $62,500 deposit, in 2014, the bank gave him a mortgage of about $240,000 to buy a $300,000 house. He fixed a large portion of it and floated a small portion. Now, given he was tied into a tenancy of his own in his rental for 6 months, he rented his new house out to, wait for it, 8 guys. But he said they were great tenants, kept it clean, and paid their money. Now working as a quantity surveyor, his income increased to $75,000 a year. Now, buying a house in Canterbury at this time was fraught. Now, that's quite the understatement. Most had earthquake damage that involved lengthy and frustrating conversations between various insurers, government officials, and builders. Basically, once he moved into his new home, Julian fought his corner hard, which you had to do to get his house repaired, and part of this process included insurance payouts that reduced his mortgage to about $140,000. Now, he owed less on his mortgage, but he continued to make the same payments to his debt, hoping to pay it off faster, and a further small insurance payout really helped. So he seemed to be making progress. Now 40 years old, he enjoyed not being in a flatting situation for once, and very much enjoyed having a professional career too. Although happier and more settled, he said he was still drinking quite a lot, and that was something that he wanted to stop. So he started to work on himself for once, starting down the path of becoming a better person, he said. Now, I then asked Julian about his KiwiSaver. Well, yes, he actually joined in 2007 when it started because his father had said to him it's a good retirement scheme to get involved in. And whenever he did work in New Zealand, he paid a portion of his income into it. He remembers his first job out of study ticking 8% employee contributions to his KiwiSaver, at the same time that 12% was being taken out of his paycheck to go towards his student loan of about $10,000, which, I'm pleased to say, he paid off by the end of 2015. Now, he bought another property with his mother in 2016 when the property connected to her semi-detached unit came up for sale. And based on the success of their last venture and blind optimism, they planned to Airbnb it. They paid $485,000, used his mother's place as collateral, paid no deposit, and from the beginning, they topped up the mortgage payment by $70 each per week. They flip-flopped between listing it on Airbnb, which was a lot of work, and having tenants who paid a steady rent. But he said, in all honesty, he can't recall the logic behind their decision-making. Now, this attitude is incredibly common amongst Kiwis who call themselves property investors. So as the remodel on his own home began to wind down, in about 2019, he decided he wanted to stop topping up the mortgage on his shared rental, and neither he nor his mum wanted to manage the property anymore. So in 2020, they put it on the market, and he headed off to Japan for a ski trip. Now, we all know exactly what happened in 2020, and the race was on to hand over the house to the new owners one day before New Zealand went into full lockdown. They sold it for $586,000, and after all the bills were paid, he came out with his share of the profit, which was about $35,000, although he said he had paid about $15,000 onto the mortgage while they owned it, reducing his profit down to about $20,000 in reality. His career, which he loved, continued to grow and evolved into project management, working on big housing and building projects that increasingly grew his income. And of course, I'd not forgotten, and nor had you, I suspect, that he still had his earthquake-damaged, uninhabitable, and therefore untenanted flat, which was part of a bigger block of flats. All of the individual owners, who all owned shares for their land and units, seriously, it was quite complicated, they got together to work as one big group with the insurer, and Julian put his hand up to offer his QS and project management skills, and what turned out to be a massive number of hours of his time during the long, convoluted, drawn-out rebuild process. The earthquakes began in 2010, and he finally got the keys to his rebuilt flat in 2018. There was also enough money left over for each of them to receive a cash amount of $40,000, plus an unexpected but incredibly kind donation to him of $10,000 for the immense amount of time and effort that he'd put in for the collective good. Now, he instantly sold his property for $306,000, paid off his remaining mortgage on it, which he had been paying interest only on, of $60,000, leaving him with about $240,000 of cash. That has to have been the hardest money he has ever made. And I just had to know, after all that mahi, why did he sell it? Because he knew he wanted to turn the house he was now living in into something pretty special. He uttered the words that are a builder's dream. He wanted to make it his forever house. He had been paid out by his insurer to do repairs on the property, but with the proceeds from the sale of his flat, he would now have the money to do even more. Plus, his gut feeling was to get away from his shared ownership structure of his flat. Well gone were any thoughts of building the portfolio, and he had come around to, I just want to be really comfortable and have a super cool little house. And he remains in the house today. Now, I'd love to tell you that the whole time he was working hard, earning increasingly higher salaries, while dealing with not one but two complex insurance claims, he was managing his money well. Sadly, not so. While he was using his logical brain to argue down the cost of a piece of wood at work so he had money to deploy in other areas of a work project, he didn't think to use the same logic in his own life. His mentality of living pay to pay had not really changed, and his money management at home was, in his words, terrible. Money came in and went straight back out the door to fund the next fun project. He was travelling overseas a lot, buying all sorts of outdoor adventure gear, and if he wanted to travel with a friend but they had no money, well, he would happily pay. And when his paycheck couldn't keep up with his lifestyle any longer, well, this was when he started to get himself in a hole with credit cards. Westpac were promoting a credit card with triple air points for a month, and he actually wanted a $10,000 vehicle right at that time. All he saw was air points, nothing else, and it felt good and sensible because he did have the cash from selling his flat, so he did pay his credit card off in full that month. But much to the delight of his bank, I'm sure, he then kept on using the credit card for fun adventures, and before long was constantly going over the 40-odd day limit and therefore paying 20-something% interest. Any small reward he earned was easily clawed back in interest payments. Now, if you're a person who pays off your credit card each month in full and receives rewards, it's people like Julian who are paying your rewards for you. When he realised he was over his limit yet again, he just dipped into the pot of money from his flat sale to pay it off. And because he kept no records of income or expenses, he didn't realise that never having enough income coming in to pay off his credit card in full each month and having to dip into savings meant he was spending more than he earned. He was living well beyond his paycheck. During 2019, he said his mind was elsewhere, on Pinterest, in design mags, talking to an architect about his new home, and no expense was spared in the design and products used, as he and his builder designed and built on the fly, and he didn't apply the rigour from work to his own house project. It all got a bit out of hand, Julian said, and he thinks he spent about $200,000, but really, he's got no idea. Now, he thought, as many do, that he was being pretty clever when he discovered a new credit card offer that has an interest-free term. So he transferred that big $10,000 debt to it, but unfortunately, he made a critical error because he didn't stop spending on the first credit card. Meanwhile, he kept frittering away the money that he had in the bank. Having owned and sold multiple properties with multiple people and rebuilt 2 under the complicated cloud of insurance rebuilds, by this stage, Julian concluded he was done with investment property. For the man hours he put in, did he really ever make any money out of property? We will never know. I've got a pretty good guess, but we will never know. His income gradually crept up over time, and by 2020 he was earning about $86,500. Now, as an avid listener of Radio New Zealand, he had often heard Mary Holm talk about money, but he never related it to his own life, until his mum gave him the Mary Holm book Rich Enough, a laid-back guide for every Kiwi, and a friend recommended he read The Barefoot Investor. Did he read it then? No. But slowly he started to pay more attention to his finances. Given he used spreadsheets at work, he started to create one at home. The trouble was his time was spent inputting data, but not taking any notice of what it was telling him. In my experience, this is super common. Plus, a manual spreadsheet is constantly out of date. It's why I do advocate using budgeting software like Pocketsmith so much, because once it's up and running, which takes a wee bit of work to get it up and running, I spend next to no time inputting the data. Instead, I spend all of my time using it to manage our personal finances. Now, Mary Holm had suggested that in regards to his KiwiSaver, Julian should just match what his employer was contributing and bring the rest of his money home as income. And using that income, she suggested that he make additional mortgage payments so he could become mortgage-free sooner. Then, after that, he could invest. Some pennies started to drop and he began to realise he was living beyond his means. Some ideas started to percolate, but it still took him time to arrest that downward slide. His ears became more finely tuned to money chat around him, and he started to apply those conversations to his own money. For example, his girlfriend said that they thought they would probably die with debt, something Kiwis often see as a given and just let slide. But that statement stuck with Julian and he really mulled it over. Still, he was not quite ready to act, but at least he began thinking about the reality of that statement, retiring with a mortgage. By 2022, he was in a relationship, one where they kept their money separate and still living a full life, which cost money to maintain. Plus, he still had a little money in the bank from the flat sale, so very willingly went out and did lots of stuff because he honestly felt that he just had so much money. But what began as hundreds of thousands of dollars had, by early 2023, been frittered down to about $40,000, which coincidentally was the same debt owing on the offset portion of his mortgage. His mortgage balance by this point was down to $100,000. He knew he had to change, and he was thinking about changing. But, as is the Kiwi way, he wanted to do even more renovations on his house, and his logic was not to use the $40,000 offsetting his mortgage, but to borrow another $25,000 from the bank instead. They offered him $50,000, but the seeds of restraint were slowly growing, and in early 2023, in about March, he stuck with increasing his mortgage back up to $125,000. Now, remember I said a friend suggested he read The Barefoot Investor. Well, after getting all the paperwork sorted with his bank on extending his mortgage, finally he went and got a copy for himself. And just a few chapters in, he thought, crikey, what have I just done? I've just put myself back into more debt. It was starting to dawn on him that while some stuff happens to us, such as earthquakes and COVID, most things are down to the choices and decisions we make. So he forgave himself the decisions he had just made and he vowed not to do it again. And I'm always saying you made the decisions you made at the time, given the information you had, but once you acquire new information, don't repeat what you now know were mistakes. He said a drumbeat of understanding was beginning to build. So using the Barefoot Investor as the base of his knowledge, he started to join personal finance-related Facebook groups to gain more knowledge. And it was in one of those groups in early 2023 that I, the happy saver, was mentioned. He signed up to budgeting app Pocketsmith and he set everything up, only to then not return to it. 1 step forward, 1.5 steps back again. Now, in another step forward, in an effort to increase his income, in late 2023, he changed to his current role and is now earning $128,000 per year. Now, Tucker from episode 108 also talked about changing jobs entirely to get a good jump in pay, and this was very much Julian's strategy as well. That retraining he did back in his late 30s is really starting to pay dividends now, but he does believe he's at the upper limit in this role. He kept hearing me mention the free 10-week online personal finance course given by UK couple Alan and Katie Donegan, who are recipients of the British Empire Medal for Services to Financial Education, and their course that they do is called Rebel Finance School, and in mid-2024 he joined their course. This led him to Mr. Money Mustache, to Choose FI, and to Kiwi-based website Money Hub. This also all led him to have a bit of an awakening that at the age of 50, he had 0 retirement plans and absolutely no clue how to financially go about it. Yes, he was in KiwiSaver, but had never asked why or how he would use it in retirement. It's pretty obvious to me that without him staging an intervention on himself, the day he cracked open his KiwiSaver account on his 65th birthday with his current behaviours, he'd just start to spend it all. Now, Rebel Finance School sets homework, and this sent him back to his spreadsheets, inputting all his expenses, and in a stroke of luck, his PocketSmith payment was one of them. The classic paying for software that you don't even use, but this woke him up and he logged back into PocketSmith, and all this time, his bank transactions had been streaming into PocketSmith, and slowly, he brought himself up to date. Later in 2024, he restructured his $125,000 mortgage with the intention being to increase payments to it. He broke it into chunks in an effort to take the advice of Mary Holm and lock in lower rates if at all possible, because this was right around the time where debt was coming off lower interest rates of 4% and jumping up to higher rates. He split the mortgage into 4 $30,000 chunks and had 3 on 6, 12 and 18-month fixed rates and 1 on floating. The lowest interest rate was now 2% higher at 6.65% and the highest was 6.89%. Then he said he went hard at paying off the highest interest rate debt as fast as he could. Now, there are often points in any journey where you notice something you never noticed before, and for Julian, it was when he realised that his banker might just be nice to him because of the flow of money that he brings to their bank. When Julian explained his new get-out-of-debt strategy to his former friendly banker, well, his banker's smile turned upside down, and for the first time, Julian's calls went unanswered. And he felt a bit hurt by this, which is absolutely the wrong response. He should be overjoyed to find out another new thing, that the borrower is always a slave to the lender, and that should spur him into a debt-free position where he deletes his banker's contact details from his phone because he just doesn't need them anymore. He went back through PocketSmith with a fine-tooth comb, and he began using that data to tweak and change where his money was. The pendulum swung in the opposite direction to the point where he knew every detail about where he spends his money. Restaurants, cafes and takeaways featured most heavily in his spending, he said. And lo and behold, this quantity surveyor, whose very nature loves the nitty-gritty detail, finally found a love of digging into the detail of his own money. Well, we're finally getting somewhere. Now, there is a 2012 blog article by Mr. Money Mustache called The Shockingly Simple Math Behind Early Retirement, which concisely shows how high your savings rate has to be to save enough money for retirement. Based on that, Julian says that if he can achieve a savings rate of 55%, he will have enough money to retire in 15 years, and he will be about 65 years old. Now, while that blog post is one of my absolute favourites, just a note for Kiwis in there is it doesn't take into account that we get universal super at 65 years old. But once Julian discovered financial independence and the concept of FU money, in 2024 he knew he needed to restart and go for it. So, about 1.5 years since he got really focused, Where is he at today? Well, his mortgage is down to $70,000, an excellent achievement. He has built an emergency fund of $10,000 and is aiming for $20,000. His KiwiSaver is with Simplicity in a high-growth fund, and he is matching his employer's 3% and no more. His balance is $130,000 and is rising. However, he is quite easily distracted from his plans sometimes, and this time by me, apparently. He had a light bulb moment in June of 2025, so very recently, when he read a blog post I wrote called Mortgage or Investing, Why Not Both? He, like many, had recently discovered the concept of investing in share markets and was now questioning whether it would be better to pay off his mortgage or lower his mortgage payments and invest. He also read all of the comments left, and it suddenly dawned on him that you are already investing if you are putting money in KiwiSaver. The Barefoot Investor talks about investing 15% into retirement. He's already investing 6% because he chose to include the employer contributions in his 15%, meaning that if he invests 9% of his take-home pay elsewhere, then he is an investor, and he can then focus on finishing off his mortgage, safe in the knowledge that he is not missing out on time in the market. And in a decision and action that was hot off the press when we spoke, he was poised to begin investing that remaining percentage into a total world fund ETF, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Julian has slashed his expenses. No more on-the-fly ski trips to Japan for him, unfortunately, and despite a wee diversion of some take-home pay into his ETF, he is attacking his mortgage with a vengeance. While he is going for it, he knows himself too, and he has left some room in his budget, just $50 a week, to splurge, a concept taken from the Barefoot Investor. He is currently on track to pay $42,000 off his mortgage in the next 12 months, meaning in under 2 years he will be mortgage-free. And these days, since he's applied the financial rigour he uses at work to his finances at home using PocketSmith, he splits his money into percentages, and it's 99% accounted for. His net worth, which is his assets, including his home, minus his debts, is $620,000, and month by month he is watching it go up, up, and up. And for the first time, he is tracking his money and he has clarity. But can he stick to his plan? Now, I am in huge favour of Julian getting out of debt once and for all and slamming that door behind him. In 2 years, he can be fully debt-free. Because I know his personality type and they are easily swayed, there is always a but. Now, I thought we were done, but he swung back around to the discussion around paying off a mortgage or investing. He is fighting a tide of others who think differently to me, and the message of pay the minimum on your mortgage and invest instead keeps appearing on his radar. Both alcohol and mortgage debt are things that, if he doesn't fight back, keep drawing him back in. And my thinking is that while there are huge benefits to paying off your mortgage, your house can't pay you an income, and you will run into the issue in the early days of being house rich but flat broke. But with your mortgage gone and a whole salary to keep, you will soon build your investments. But Julian, like most people having discovered investing, now wants some balance in their lives. They no longer want to be all in housing. They see it as risky. Despite his newfound plan, he is leaning towards minimising his mortgage payments and sinking the excess into investments for the next couple of years. 1 step forward, 1.5 steps back. His steadfastness is wavering already. In mid-2024, his goal was to be mortgage-free by 55 and have $150,000 invested, which is an arbitrary number, and given his income and level of debt, it could be unrealistic from the get-go. So unsurprisingly, he is worried he won't meet both goals on his current trajectory, and given he has a relatively secure, high-paying job, he's very tempted to minimise his mortgage payments and hit the gas on investing. Julian is in the midst of a crisis that many late starters face, the crushing reality of having screwed up our finances for decades and needing to play catch-up. We go on a deep dive of learning and begin to implement some dramatic changes. but we fail to stay on the new course and stick to the new plan. And in veering off course so soon after starting, we are letting the chaotic money skills that got us this far in life get involved in our finances again. Without behaviour change, there won't be a change. Julian knows this, and it is absolutely something that he is working on. He has made the decision to stop drinking and is currently working with a counsellor to manage his spontaneous nature, which sees him lurch and change direction so quickly. And I was so pleased to hear him so focused on his overall well-being, because that will impact his decision-making. He's come such a long way and now actively searches for answers using books. He's finally gotten around to reading The Simple Path to Wealth. He's reading websites, listening to podcasts, speaking to a counsellor, and people like myself that he can bounce ideas off. But our conversation ended in late June of 2025, and he is very much in the midst of huge life changes with the way he is managing his money. So this is where I'm going to start to wrap things up for you, but stay till the bitter end, because just a few days before recording, I got an update. Now, before I do wrap up, I have another quick message from today's sponsor. If your finances are holding you back from living the life you want, try Pocketsmith out. They've got the tools to help you make money management easier. And have we got a deal for you? Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. That's pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. Oh man, I am trying to keep these episodes shorter, but I'm my own worst enemy. I do love to chat, and so does Julian, and we spoke for over 4 hours. And I still didn't get to all of my questions, but I just find chatting to people about the way they manage their money and how the way they handle money has evolved over time endlessly interesting. If you talk to someone who is financially successful and you ask them to sum up their life, they're often pragmatic and make their arrival at financial independence feel very linear. Well, in my experience, Julian, who is a top bloke, is a beautiful example of this. It is exceedingly rare for people to follow a clear path. Most duck and weave, win and lose, and eventually manage to take more steps forward than they did backwards, and that leads them to their version of wealth. Julian was super interesting to speak with, and there was a lot that for the sake of time I had to leave out, but I think you can clearly see that he is a work in progress, as we all are. But what will he do next? He left me on a bit of a cliffhanger, and I'd already made a mental note to do an update episode one day, because 2 words came to mind when I thought of Julian: impulsive and perfectionist. And these are 2 characteristics that tend to want to battle it out. And I'm no psychologist, but it might explain his hectic life. Add into the mix that he's got the gift of the gab, and I can see why he jumped at opportunities to decide on a whim to head to all parts of the world with a variety of fun people. Eventually, his own actions and fate steered him into a role that fits him perfectly, because working as a quantity surveyor, you need attention to detail with the ability to pivot hard when an architect changes the plans. And as he settles into his 5th decade, it is a huge relief to him that he's finally managed to direct his busy energy into limiting the boom and bust cycle of his financial life. Finally, he's no longer living pay to pay and is budgeting, but there is still room to grow and improve. Over the years, he has made so many knee-jerk housing decisions that while they might have kept him entertained and frustrated, they really didn't move the needle on his finances as much as just investing a steady paycheck might have. Now that he is in a home he loves, he is hopeful that his days of housing indecision might be over. Just like he plans long-term build projects at work, the same attention to detail in his personal life will, pun intended, build something pretty awesome that will be around for the longer term, if he can stay the course and not get sidetracked by the next shiny opportunity, whether that be an overseas trip, share investing, or buying another property. I think if he found himself wavering, just tapping back into any of the resources that he's mentioned might bring him back onto course, and I really hope it does. Well, now, finally, for that last-minute update, Julian emailed me to say that he'd been thinking about the whole pay off your mortgage versus invest debate going on in his head. Due to the economic times we seem to be in, A few people he knows lost their jobs and are struggling to get back into full-time, well-paid work, which means they are personally, financially struggling. And it showed him that his own emergency fund is too low. It couldn't cope with the type of break from work his associates are experiencing. So he's decided to make it a priority to boost his cash reserves up to that $20,000 emergency fund that he wanted to have as quickly as possible. This would cover him for 6 months if he couldn't find work. He said that it's really incredible what a massive mental load it takes off having a mojo fund or an emergency fund sitting there. And once he's got it to $20,000, he is turning his attention back to his mortgage. And in his words, smashing it out. Investing will come after that. To keep him on track, he's employing 2 mantras: make do, no new, and mortgage free by 53. And I might text him those mantras from time to time to keep him on track. So, there you have it. He's lived a big life and he wants to live a big retirement. And with 14 years until the technical retirement age of 65, he does have time to reach his goals. But the window is closing on how many times he can reset. And I really encourage him and anyone listening who is like him to know your numbers. Map out a financial plan with specific financial points to hit along the way and systematically go about ticking them off. Julian took decades to find his stride. Now he just has to settle into a good and consistent rhythm. So phew, that is it from me this time. And a huge thank you, Julian, for all of the many enjoyable hours we chatted back and forth. I loved it and I wish you well, and I look forward to keeping in touch. So that is all from me this week, and you know if you want to get in touch you can find me over at thehappysaver.com, and please do share my podcast and my blog with your friends. It is the best way that I can help other people learn something new about money. And finally, I would love it if you would talk more about money with your own friends and whānau and help me continue to help others be better with money. So until next time, happy saving.